The topic of today's discussion is Americano. And if you've seen me or my colleagues out talking Americano, this can be a little bit different of a focus. I typically talk about strictly the aperitif wine and trying to educate how that as a category of aperitif wine differs from vermouth and quinquina. And we may touch a little bit upon this, but today we're going to go deeper, further back in history, delve much more into the cocktail Americano, and I'd say probably 1870, maybe up to pre-war, maybe a little post-war.
We'll see how far we get.
Yeah, and there are many facets of the Americano story, and there's a fascinating post-war story that maybe we'll save for another time of Americano and its imprint or near demise for that and vermouth. But anyway, let me hand it over to David, and we'll take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. This brings me to our generous sponsors. I'm a complete PowerPoint idiot, so this is the second PowerPoint I've ever done, so please be forgiving. They make me do it here, so I'm trying. I'm trying to be cooperative, which is unlike me, but whatever. House Alpens, if you don't know Eric Seed, he's responsible for importing half of the great stuff we drink in our cocktails today, and I'm not fucking kidding. I mean, Cocky Vermouths, Miro Vermouth, Spanish Vermouth, right? We've got Aperitivo Cappelletti, one of the many delightful Italian aperitivi we'll talk about, and Amaro Sfumato, among one of many Amari in your portfolio. Batavia Arak Van Oosten. I forgot to put Heyman's Gin on there, but that's on there. And these are some of the absolutely delightful products we have to work with. I have all of them in my home liquor cabinet, and I'm sad when any one of those bottles is empty. So, I mean, this is a A-list sponsorship for a drinks geek. So I'm very thrilled to have you here, Eric, and thank you for this. I know it's going to be a little weird, but we'll see what happens. It could be amusing. The first drink we have here is, hold on, let me get this. There we go. Yeah, I was looking for the right arrow, but I found it. Okay, so we're starting with an Americano. The name of the session is Al Americano, which is, if you put a little dash after the al, it's Italian for American style. If you leave the dash out, it's all Americano, and we're kind of going to come at it from both perspectives. I'm sorry we're doing this now at 3 o'clock on a Saturday in Tales. I look around and I look within myself and I can't decide whether we should be reciting Shakespeare, we few, we happy few, or Emma Lazarus, give me you're tired, you're wretched, you're poor, and you're hungry. But it's a little of both, I think. This is the survivors. God bless you guys for having any thirst for anything, including education at this point of Tales of the Cocktail, because it's been a long week. It's been a fun one, but it's been a long one. Please don't drink yet those samples that we put in front of you. We're going to have a little arts and crafts moment later that'll be extremely adorable. So if you don't mind just hanging on to those, I know they're standing there staring at you, and I bet half of them are empty already, knowing bartenders. But anyway, they're there. I'm going to talk about the Italian way of drinking, the American way of drinking, and how they kind of quietly hooked up in the dark and came up with the modern drinks world. The American way of drinking in the mid-19th century, we had cocktails, juleps, things like that. It was heavily English in its inspiration. All these American drinks, almost all of them descend from punch, the original, kind of the big bang of mixed drinks with spirits in the 1600s. You know, punch, citrus, plus sugar, spirits, water, and some kind of spice. Almost all these American drinks take off on that, replacing the citrus with something else. So juleps, you replace it with mint. You've got slings where you replace it with nothing else, which is a little sad. You've got cocktails where you replace it with bitters. And then the cocktails and the punch start mutating, and you have these drinks that have like bitters and citrus and things like that, like crustas, etc. But it's heavily English derived. Also, there's a lot of French influence in the early days, before the Civil War. Americans are drinking things like pousse cafes, layers of liqueurs, and various American versions on that, sleepers, locomotives, things like that. They're also drinking cups. That's a little bit English, a little bit French. It's largely German, though. There's a large German influence coming in the middle of the century, where you're drinking these things that are based on wine with liqueurs in them and fancy flavorings. Those are quite popular as well. And those are the dominant influences. There's a Dutch influence as well in the gin that Americans drink. They drink Geneva. But what there is not at all in the years before the Civil War, kind of the formational years of American drinking, is any kind of Italian influence. Italy wasn't a country then. Italy was a collection of small city-states, most of them under foreign occupation, and their industry was very low. There wasn't a lot of, the Industrial Revolution kind of missed them out because the foreign occupation, nobody's really investing in capital. There's a lot of craftsmanship, a lot of low-level industry, but nothing, no big companies, no dominant people with the power to export their stuff. Italian drinking goes back, 2,500 years. It's old. The Romans, if you go to, say, Ostia Antica, the seaport for Rome, that got silted up and buried and was uncovered in the early 20th century, right in the square next to the main temple in town. You go around the corner and there's a counter at about this high out on the street with a slightly higher counter behind it with holes for wine jugs, and that's a bar. So, they were bartending forever. They were making drinks, wine, based on wine. There may have been spirits. The standard story is that Greco-Roman antiquity did not know the use of distilled spirits, but it turns out it's probably a little more complicated than that. It's one of the most famous Roman wines, Falernin. It turns out one of the most authoritative ancient writers on science and agriculture and things like that, Pliny, says that wine burns at room temperature. I don't know any wine that burns at room temperature unless it's bourbon. So, they were doing something. I mean, even still to this day, a lot of countries in Latin America, the folk word for spirits is vino. So, it's that wine could cover a lot of treatments, and there could be some of that could have been distilled. We just don't know. Archaeology hasn't found much, but archaeology, the problem with that is you can distill wine with any kind of equipment. It does not have to look like the kind of still we have. You can do it with clay pots of various kinds. There are many ways of distilling. So there may have been distillation then, we just haven't realized that that's what those pots were used for. We just don't know. So anyway, I'm already digressing far too much, and that means we'll probably make it up to about 1900 here, not 1950. But anyway, so this Italian school of drinking is very old. In the Renaissance, actually even in the late Middle Ages, Italy discovers or rediscovers distillation, and it starts off as medicinal. People are taking all these botanicals and extracting them with alcohol and trying to make like these cure-all potions, these things to fix you up. And unlike most of the potions then, at least this one had something in there that worked, that something being the alcohol. It starts off being strictly medicinal, but you know how it goes. Well, I might not be sick today, but maybe I'll be sick tomorrow. And what if I take the medicine today so I don't get sick tomorrow? I mean, that's I've seen that work with muscle relaxants in high school, known as methaqualone. My muscles are fairly relaxed, but in case they get tight, I better just take 2 of these Gorilla biscuits and see what happens. That's a common logic. And eventually, Italy starts drinking these things, if not recreationally, flat out recreationally, then the Italians have a way of an Italian culture is very complicated. My father was Italian. I spent a lot of time over there as a kid, so I speak as a little bit of a, at least I've seen the inside of the culture a little bit, and I hope my Italian friends here aren't offended if I say things about Italian culture. But the Italians have an interesting way of making medicinal and recreational just go right alongside each other. So after a big dinner, just for your digestion, you'll have a grappa or an amaro. It's not because you want to drink, mind you. It's because your digestion might suffer if you don't have this. And before a meal, Italians by and large are not huge recreational drinkers, but before a meal, you'll have an aperitivo just to make sure your appetite is working. Just a little drop of something. We'll say, let's just have a cocktail because it's the end of the day and it's been a pig of a day. The Italians says, it's more medicinal. It's really to get your system in harmony. And that's actually a fairly civilized way of looking at it. And it works pretty well. So long tradition of this and these bitter concoctions. The bitter is good for digestion is the theory. And you have every town in Italy has its own proprietary amaro. It has its own aperitivo by, the middle, especially moving into the middle of the 19th century. Italy reunifies after a good deal of struggle and a lot of fighting, but by 1870, suddenly Italy is a country. And parts of that country are quite rich. And so they start building industries. There's this huge rush of energy. And you start getting things happening in the drink world, too. In 1867, a cafe owner, Gaspare Campari, puts together his bitter al uso d'Olanda, Dutch-style bitter. And it's very red, and it's got, rhubarb and orange in it. And it turns out to be quite popular, and he sells a lot of it. But, in America, you get a product like that, and you sell a lot of it. You drop everything, and you focus on that product. Like John Stith Pemberton, the pharmacist who one day comes up with this temperance drink based on cocaine instead of alcohol, so that nobody will be mad at him for selling alcohol. And it calls it Coca-Cola. And next thing you know, he's in the Coca-Cola business strictly. That's what he does, and he's selling Coca-Cola. Italy, it doesn't quite work like that. This guy, Gaspare Campari, has a huge hit on his hand, but he's still making all the different liquors. In America, you go to a bar and you order a drink and the bartender makes it for you. In Italy, you would go to a bar and the bartender would have all the popular drinks pre-bottled and labeled. And every bar would make the same drinks. So you'd have all these styles of bitters, Dutch bitters, French bitters, etc. Everybody had their own version. They'd all be bottled. You'd have all the cordials, all the various liqueurs, all bottled, pre-bottled, labeled behind the bar. That was the Italian way. The Italians are secret control freaks. And this is the way, I'm not going to trust some guy I have to hire to tend bar at night to make my formulas right. I'm going to bottle them up. I'm going to put them on the shelf there, and he can serve them like that. And some of these things get famous. There's one, Scotum Bum Zoom from Milano, that was hugely popular there. The recipe has been lost, but it's popular at one cafe in the 1870s, 1880s. It's the basis of the fortune of this cafe in the Piazza della Rosa, which is the first stand-up bar in Milano. Where you stand up at the bar and take drinks, and it's pre-bottled. Some people say about it, "Che orribile sapore," what a horrible flavor. They call it an amaro beveraggio, a bitter beverage, an inferno miscuglio. Miscuglio is like a shitty version of a mixture. It's like Italian has these ways of just taking words and ramping them down. So it's like an infernal mixturage. It's something just gross. All these, some of the original drinkers call it that, but still people line up to drink it. And the formula was invented by this old workman at the cafe, this guy his name has come down to us only as Giorgio, his first name, and eventually he signs it over to the brothers Branca. Is this Fernet Branca? I'm not sure. The description comes kind of close, though. And, I like Fernet plenty, but it is a little bit of an infernal mixturage if you think about it. And these are the kinds of things that these cafes are selling. And, each has their specialty, but they're also making the same ones as the others are making. There's another one in Milano. You hear about Sesaminga, which is kind of like who gives a damn, and in Milanese dialect. And that one has some kind of lemonade component, and it's also bitter and alcohol in there, and it's quite popular. And these things are not really. These are the ones that aren't preserved. The ones that are preserved have now become brands, and now are proprietary. Eventually, for instance, the Campari company, by 1905, they get rid of all their other products and just focus on the Amaro, and also they have a Digestivo, and those are so you have the regular Campari and this other like little sweet liqueur Campari, and those are the two products that they sell forever. Other companies are like that too. If you go to the museum at Martini and Rossi, you see they made everything originally. They've got 20, 30 different products in their line, and eventually they just slowly got rid of those as they grew in size and became less Italian and more international. We'll talk about that. But early on, some of these products start making their way to America. Before the Civil War, there was some vermouth imported into America, but it was usually from France. There were a lot of French immigrants, for instance, that came over with the gold rush, and so they'd get French products and French vermouth. You see Noy Prat available in California in like 1853. You see it available here in New Orleans, of course, huge French population. You see it available in New York, where there was also a big French and also international kind of cosmopolitan population. But nobody's really, Americans themselves aren't really drinking these things. You find them in little importers' ads in the back of newspapers. We also have this vermouth stuff. It's not like nobody's using it. Nobody really knows what to do with it. For instance, an ad from the 1853 New York Courier talks about Italian bitters, aquavite, vermouth, something else that's illegible here, and it says the best tonics known. So it's obviously just drink them straight. I'm going to go skip ahead here. So you see also, other people auctioning this stuff off. That they import it. They kind of go to Italy and buy whatever is for sale. That's how commerce tended to work, and they bring it home and see if they can sell it. And nobody's really selling it too much until you see something in the New York Herald in 1868, a description of a banquet. It was a bohemian banquet, as it was called, meaning, a little bit weird, at Delmonico's, the fanciest restaurant in North America, or South America for that matter, in the Western Hemisphere, for the female, it turns out, cirrhosis club, not cirrhosis, sorosis, sisterhood, not cirrhosis, although I frequently see one lead to the other. But and they began their banquet with sherry and bitters, vermouth cocktails, and other appetizing mixtures usually included in the program on these occasions. Now, this is the first appearance in print I've been able to find for a vermouth cocktail, and it's like, wait, what? Where they've been usually on the menu. So somebody, we don't know who, had been taking this vermouth that was starting to come over as Italy, reunifies and starts building industry and starts shipping stuff over more, and somebody is taking it and turning it into a cocktail. How do you make a vermouth cocktail? Well, Haney's Steward and Barkeeper's Manual from 1869 says 1 wine glass of vermouth, which a wine glass is 2 ounces, 1 very small piece of ice, 1 small piece of lemon peel, and serve in a thin-stemmed wine glass with curved lip. But other people took it a step beyond, because any liquor to make into a cocktail back in the day, what did you do to it in the 19th century? A little history quiz for the geeks in the audience. What would you put in there? sugar and bitters, right? The vermouth already had the sugar. This guy, Haney, the guy, whoever it was who wrote Haney's, thought the vermouth was sufficiently bitter that it didn't need like the addition of bitters, sufficiently flavored. Other people wanted more bitters in there. And the other early recipes for vermouth cocktail going forth into the 19th century always put bitters in there. You have, vermouth cocktails by 1873 are listed among the popular drinks of the day. And it's not like any cocktails made with vermouth. It's just these things. It's still like the kind of the protoplasm days of modern mixology. And it's just a simple drink. Vermouth stirred with ice and strained or served on the rocks, lemon peel, a couple dashes of bitters. Simple, appetizing, a nice light alternative, because if you're not drinking that, you're drinking a whiskey cocktail, which is the same thing but with whiskey, or a gin cocktail, the same thing but with Geneva. And those will cut you up sufficiently more than that. So this was, a good alternative, a good aperitif cocktail that gave you a place to go where you didn't have all the spirits in there, and they were appreciated as such. You see, like one newspaper article is talking about what the various senators are drinking in Washington, and one guy, or actually it wasn't even a senator, I believe it was William Randolph Hearst Sr., is known for drinking vermouth cocktails because he tries to avoid alcohol. If your other option is like a bonded whiskey cocktail, you could see that's a little bit of a temperance choice. 1886, you see vermouth cocktails with a dash of absinthe in New York, extremely sporty. That's getting into like real mixology, and also, the dash of absinthe was supposed to lead, next thing you know, to drinking little glasses of absinthe with water dripped in them, then drinking absinthe frappes, and then drinking absinthe cocktails, absinthe and bitters, shaken, stirred straight. And at that point, you were ready for the insane asylum, as far as they were concerned. And that was absinthe really scared the hell out of people at the time. Throughout into the 1880s, there were hotels in New York, for instance, specializing in vermouth cocktails, the Grand Hotel on Broadway. And the leading firm at this point is the Martini firm from Torino, because they are well capitalized. They have a railroad spur right by their factory, and they are very good business people. Martini is the business guy. It was originally Martini and Sola. They bought Sola out, and then Rossi comes in, and Rossi, was an even better business guy. And suddenly you've got them selling a lot of vermouth. In 1891, you had 84,000 gallons of vermouth imported into the U.S. That's already a lot. 150,000 gallons in 1892, 186,000 gallons in 1893, over 200,000 gallons in 1894. You think this thing is taking off like vodka did in the 50s. I mean, it's like a rocket. Can you imagine that kind of growth? That's phenomenal. And in 1896, they're thinking, maybe 225,000 gallons. In 1905, an Italian consular official, Guido Rosati, sends a report home from New York describing the American market for vermouth makers. This is what do you do in this market? He says, the first shipments. I was lazy and neglected to translate this, so you got to bear with me slightly. The first shipments of vermouth to this market date from the beginning of our commercial ties with that country, the U.S., so circa 30 years ago. So, it's really the beginning of Italy as a nation. They're shipping this stuff over. It's going over there. And then he talks about the qualities of vermouth you need to send over here to get into the American market. He says a vermouth, to make any headway in that market, has to present qualities as much of composition and taste, and these qualities by which it mixes well with other liquors and other ingredients, mostly bitter ones, in union with which it becomes consumed. So it's what the Americans are doing with this stuff. He's basically telling his people is they're mixing it with bitters and other spirituous ingredients. And if you want to make any headway in America, you have to send something that's mixable, that the people can use like that. They're not going to drink it our style. And he says, this is all mixed together in il cocktail. Un tutto armonico e gradevole. This is when Italian is beautiful. A whole that is harmonic and pleasant. So it's like this pleasant harmonic unity of the cocktail. So even then, this guy's kind of getting it. He's obviously been drinking in the New York bars and going to the fancy places, and he gets that this cocktail is kind of a good thing. This is something that we might find pleasant. So it says vermouth has to have a certain the right level of alcohol between 15 and 17%. It has to have an irreprehensible clarity. It has to be perfectly clear, and even at low temperature. So it's going to need some chill filtering. Because why the low temperature? Because how are we drinking it mixed with ice? It can't look cloudy. It has to be of a golden color, a golden yellow, with a little dark tint to it. Not too sweet, not too bitter, not too aromatic. Dryish, a little perfumed, simple and harmonic, and harmonious to the taste, with a slightly bitter, lightly and pleasantly bitter aftertaste. So he's kind of like going into extreme detail here, but the Italian market wanted to know. They were having huge amounts of growth here, and so he says this Martini and Rossi built the taste for this product, but other people and that in 1905 that was 2/3 of the U.S. market, but that still left 1/3 for other brands, and there were numerous other brands. Cora was a big one here. Cinzano was a big one, but there were plenty of others that came in. I don't know how much Cocchi exported because they were so popular locally. They probably didn't need to export much, but I haven't come across them in magazine ads in New York, but that doesn't mean they weren't here.
There was some in North America, but interestingly, there was actually more in South America.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story.
Right.
That's fully owned territory almost. Okay, so this is, the Italians, this is how you sell in America. Oh, we do have a cocktail coming here, don't we? Is this our Fernet cocktail? All right, this is jumping ahead a little, but you can start in on this, and just because we want you to be hydrated and we want your digestion to be okay. So this is an American cocktail from 1906 from Louis Muckensturm. Its specs are an ounce of Fernet, 2 ounces of Cocchi Vermouth de Torino, a little splash of Ferrand dry orange curacao, garnished with a mint leaf, a drink from Boston, but the same kind of thing was being made all over the U.S. Okay, so you get consular reports like that coming back to Italy, and the curious thing to me is what the Italians do. Some people would say, all right, we're going to make this stuff for export, and it's not, we'll send it over to America and whatever. The Americans can do what they want. We're going to keep with our own traditions. And the Italians have a good, strong history of keeping with their own traditions. I don't think there's more than a single McDonald's in any town in Italy. Most towns will have one, but that's it. Italy is very conservative when it comes to gustatory stuff. And yet you find, hold on, America, you find this book from Arnaldo Strucchi, was an enologist. He writes this very detailed book on Il Vermouth de Torino, the Torino is the headquarters of Italian vermouth. He writes it in 1907. Unfortunately, this has never been translated as far as I know, because this is an extremely useful book. It gives you everything but the exact formulas that the various producers are using, but it gives you lists of all the botanicals that are used in vermouth, what kind of wine to use, levels of sweetness, etc. But he also, being an Italian, he tends to step back and get a little philosophical. And he has a chapter in here on vermouth, chinato, and bitter vermouth, because what the Italians have done when they've seen what the Americans are doing with this stuff, it goes back to Italian mixology. In America, you go to the bar, they put the bitters in, they stir it together. The Italians don't do it that way, right? They're like, I'm going to put the bitters in to the bottle with the vermouth, and I'm going to bottle it and label it and set it out there pre-mixed so nobody can screw it up. Because I don't trust that guy behind the bar. I mean, or whatever. But it's like, it's my vermouth. I'm completely in charge of it. Oh, cheers, by the way. Ooh. That's a hell of a drink. Okay, so Arnaldo Strucchi in this chapter, he starts off, he says, I'm going to begin by saying that I don't have any sympathy for these preparations, these pre-mixed vermouth and bitters things that had come up. He says, and because they're for the most part befoulings of the true typical vermouth of Torino. Deturpazione is this nasty word he uses, like this almost shitting on of these things. But since they are admitted, actually even sought out by commerce, which loves, as in clothes, to change things all the time, to change styles according to fashion. He says, because, you know, that's the fashion, I guess I better spend some time on them. And but he adds this: it's much more preferable that whoever likes to drink a vermouth with some modification or special flavor in it that makes it either more bitter or sweeter or with a particular aroma, he should add a little bit of the preferred liqueur to the vermouth while tasting it, rather than pre-mix it and ruin all the vermouth. So is that, but whose style of mixing drinks is that? You do it a la minute. It's American style, right? So clearly, there's been some almost subterranean conversation going back and forth between these two countries in the force of commerce. The Italians send the vermouth over. The Americans say, this stuff is okay. Let's put some bitters in it. It goes back to Italy. The Italians go, oh, they like vermouth with bitters. We'll put the bitters in it and send it to them. But the Americans prefer to do it their way. Meanwhile, some of the Italians are saying, that way of mixing it with the bitters, that's actually not so bad. We have a little experiment here in front of us that you guys, or at least most of you, have been all very patient about. 3 cups, right? Left to right, Cocchi Vermouth di Torino. This lovely Amaro Sfumato di rhubarb, bitter smoked rhubarb, as it's known. Is it actually a little bit smoked, or not
Actually,
really?
not smoked.
It's a heavily dried rhubarb that kind of seems smoked. And then finally, we have the Cocchi Rosa Americano. It's rosé vermouth with the bitters mixed in by Cocchi, basically. It's an Americano style. So fortified wine with the aromatics in. But what I suggest is take a little sip of each of these first 2, then put a little of the second one into the first one, just a little, and see what it does. I mean, the original one is, how does it taste, the vermouth? Well, how would you describe it? Yeah, besides delicious, which I will absolutely agree. This is a lovely vermouth. But, artisanal, made really just by these people on their farm, and for a very long time.
No real bitter.
No. It's got aromatics, though, right? But it doesn't have that, like, appetite-stimulating dash of bitterness. And then this stuff is, that's all bitter. That's a pretty intense example of Amaro. This is good for this. This works well. And if you put in just, your bartender's splash, get something that's pretty tasty with that little that little hint of bitterness to make it an aperitif rather than just this sort of sweet aromatic thing. I might even put just a little dash more. But that's the American way. Is everybody likes theirs different. America's America. We're like, you can't tell me what to do. You can't tell me how much bitters to put in my goddamn vermouth cocktail. But the Italians are like, more. It's like either si fa or non si fa. Either this is done or this is not done. Too much bitters, that's not done. We don't do that. So it's a very, very cultural difference. I mean, let's taste it against the Rosa and see, what a proper Italian, this is how it's done level of bitterness is. Pretty low. It's very balanced, right? Yeah. It's harmonious. There's just a little hint of bitterness there, but it's there. Especially like the consul was saying, that little slightly bitter aftertaste is very nice. So you could see, this is kind of the process, the different schools illustrated. What happens in Italy is we did that. This is from Martini and Rossi's museum. These companies have museums where they don't even know what's in it. They haven't figured out in detail the history. But look at that, that Martini Rossi Americano in the back. What do you notice about the label? American flag motif, very strong on it. There's their bitter in the front. They were making bitter back then still. So they've got their own Americano bottled, mostly for the Italian market. These things, as far as I can tell, had absolutely no traction in America, the bitter the Americanos. They might have tried exporting them. Americans didn't drink them. They wanted their own, to make their own. But that's Martini and Rossi's version. A couple more. These are probably from around 1900 because they had already launched their Bianco. So they've got a Bianco Americano and a regular Americano. And again, it's just the vermouth and the bitters mixed in the bottle. Or, as they learned to do, is you don't have to make the vermouth, make the bitters, mix the two of them together. You can make the vermouth and add the botanical bitter infusion, which is an easier way, and it cuts out a step, and it gives you more control over what you're doing. You don't have to keep adding alcohol to this thing. The Italians do not like their drinks to be particularly strong, many of them. They're after-dinner drinks, yes. The other ones, no.
Are the flags on that bottle, are those regional flags from?
Those are the... those are, I think, the prizes they won at various exhibitions, I suspect, in various cities of Italy. But that's, I'm not positive, though. They wouldn't let me take it out of the case to look at it. Here's Campari's version. I'm sorry for the dark picture, but you can see their graphics are, as always, just ace. Campari is very good. They got the American flag dynamic in the background. Americano, all bitter Campari with the dynamic curve, etc. Davide Campari, who ran the company, who built it into the kind of the powerhouse it is, was absolutely obsessed with art and graphics and had a very, very good eye and knew who to hire and came up. I mean, if they launched that again, everybody would buy that. Who the hell wouldn't want that? I mean, look at that bottle. Another absolutely lovely one, Cocchi Americano. This is the original, I guess, original label. This is from the Cocchi Museum. I don't have a year for it, but as you can see, the Americano part of it was absolutely explicit. We are putting the fucking American flag right on the label, in any way possible. And that's amazing. It's a real moment. And again, this is not for the American market. These aren't going over to America. This is for Italians. Italians, for all their conservatism, They also are very good at finding something good and instantly adopting it. You know, it's like, okay, this is cool, and suddenly it's like a flock of birds that turns all at once. Like 15 years ago, everybody in Italy at the cafe was drinking Campari soda. Suddenly, everybody switches to Aperol Spritz, a phenomenally refreshing drink on a hot day. And now, everywhere you go, you do not see a Campari soda on the table. It's all Aperol Spritz. Every single person, every table of every cafe is full of Aperol Spritzes. And it's just like that. Everybody said, yeah, that's better. We're going to do that. I mean, a Campari soda is wonderful, but Aperol Spritz is a particularly pleasant and also way lower in alcohol even than Campari soda. And the Italians are very, very conscious of that. They prefer, they tend to not like to get all liquored up before dinner, unlike us. So you start seeing, you see these things coming in. The American way of making these things starts spreading. It's validated in part by the Italian market here, but it's also one final thing from the Campari Museum. They also made bottled cocktails. This is a bottled Martini cocktail. So they're also going even deeper into the American. They're saying, you're not buying our Americano. What if we make your Martini cocktail? So that would be sweet vermouth, gin, bitters, maybe a little sweetness. Let's bottle that and send it over. And those did sell over here. We were perfectly happy to drink a bottled Martini. Why wouldn't we be? The Fernet cocktail we already did. As you can see, I'm so on top of this PowerPoint, it's frightening. You start seeing this idea of bittered vermouth. At first, it's a two-way conversation between Italy and America without anybody actually talking to each other. They're just sending orders back and forth. Send us this, send us that, what's selling, what isn't selling, let's try this. And suddenly, you've got this crazy thing going on. 1889, you see in this guy Lefebvre, the first French cocktail book, Les Boissons Americaines, a very interesting book. He has a cocktail called the Vermouth du Turin, the Torino Vermouth. Vermouth du Turin au Fernet Branca, which is basically what we just had, right? It's they don't have jiggers in France, so it's a Madeira glass of vermouth, a liqueur glass of Fernet Branca. That's basically what we had right here. And then you mix it with crushed ice and a little bit of seltzer. So that's bitters and vermouth with soda water. So the soda water starts coming in early, and that seems to solve a lot of problems with drinks like this because they're very concentrated and a little sticky. And you lighten them up with soda water, they're pretty good. You see that in 1889. In 1892, William Schmidt, the great creative New York bartender, second most famous bartender of the 19th century after Jerry Thomas, publishes this crazy-ass book. I don't know, some of you have probably seen this, The Flowing Bowl by the only William, with just insane recipes, and many of them. They involve things like stenciling the names of newspapers on top of egg white foam, on top of a drink, and all these crazy ingredients. Creme de rose. He probably has 15 drinks with creme de rose in it. It's like it tastes like hand soap, but still, it's fun. It's very elegant. But he's got, for instance, the appetizer à l'Italien. Why he writes it in French? Well, he wrote a lot of things in French because it was the classy language. He was actually German, but what the hell. 2/3 glass of vino vermouth. Vino vermouth is how vermouth was often called because that's what it said on the label, vermouth wine in Italian. And so over here it becomes vino vermouth. So he's got, 2/3 of a glass of vino vermouth, 1/3 of Fernet Branca. Where have we heard that before? A dash of absinthe. Woo. 2 dashes of gum syrup and a little ice in the glass, stir, strain, and serve. Basically, what we have here from Louis Muckensturm, plus absinthe. I really don't think you need absinthe in this drink. I think it probably has enough flavor in it. Really pretty close to enough anyway. Then he's got another one, L'Appetit, the appetite, 2 lumps of ice, 2/3 of Vino Vermouth, 1/3 of Fernet Branca. Where have we heard this before? Slice of orange. And he says, this drink is much en vogue among Southern Europeans. So clearly, somebody is kind of talking about, what's happening in Italy, where people are putting the digestivi, the Amaros in the vermouth, and it's kind of getting back to America, like you could do more of this. You can play around with it even more. It's not just the standard dashes of bitter in a cocktail. And now for the first time, Italy is, exporting more stuff. You're getting things like Fernet Branca, Ferrochina Bisleri, very popular, this iron bitters. If you've ever tasted iron bitters, they taste like iron. They're not good. They're really not good. In London, you start seeing this, the Hunger Provoker, a good translation of L'Appetit, I suppose. This is this guy, Don Wilkes, The Bachelor book from 1902. 2 lumps of ice, 2/3 of Vino Vermouth, 1/3 of Fernet Branca, 1 slice of orange. So either taken from there, or this is, but you've already got the orange garnish in there, which comes up over and over and over again with this, with the variations of this drink. You've got so you've got all kinds of things like this. These kind of things go back to Italy. They have the Martini Corporation puts out a little cocktail book, and it doesn't have a date. It's in their archives. It's probably around 1910, between 1910 and 1920. Gorgeous graphics of fighting cocks and all these really, really lovely fonts that are no longer used by anybody. But it's only got a few cocktails in it. It's got L'American Martini Cocktail, Il Martini Cocktail Suite, Il Martini Cocktail Suite for ladies, written in English. That uses a vanilla vermouth. Like, does anybody know what? Well, I know one person here for sure knows, because he wrote the book on vermouth, and he's probably ready to kill me by now. Sorry, Francois. But there is a vanilla vermouth. It was a particular style. It was one of those things that Arnaldo Strucchi was talking about, is like that people were mixing into their vermouth and bottling it and selling it that made them unhappy. Does anybody know what the big brand of vanilla vermouth we're all using now is? Carpano Antico, right? That's not a standard vermouth. It's a particular style, extra sweet, perfumed with vanilla. It's not, it's not a substitute for a regular like Cocchi Vermouth de Torino. It's a different style, and it's good to keep that in mind. I find when mixing drinks, because I go to so many bars, and this is me both digressing, wasting your time, and ranting. So 3 things. My math is also bad, but I find so many people use that as like their go-to vermouth, and it ruins as many drinks as it helps. It's one of those things. You got to be a little bit careful with it, because that vanilla thing is just penetrating. But anyway, so it's also for ladies, at least according to the Martini Company in 1900 what or whatever. But it's also got a Martini Cocktail Dry and an American Manhattan Cocktail. But the interesting thing about these is these recipes are all for making a liter of the stuff. So, the Italians are like, we can't, just really do this American style. We gotta keep doing it the way we do it. It's still, not, fully there. Every other country in Europe at this point is abounding in cocktail books. There are dozens from France has a whole stack of them. Spain is incredibly fertile in cocktail books. Denmark, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Germany, tons of them. Really even definitive ones already before 1920. Italy, crickets, nothing. There are no early Italian cocktail books as far as I've been able to find. The first one, maybe this Martini thing, and that's only a booklet with 6 drinks in it. Or it may be one from 1920, Ferruccio Mazzon, about whom nothing is known, other than he's probably from Trieste, where my dad was from. So, I'll shout out to a homie, but I don't know a damn thing about him, unfortunately. But so this is, Italy is still kind of holding back, at least in some ways. But on the other hand, there are American bars in Italy, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit. I will start with a little quote from the Anglo-American Times of London from 1868. And the guy says, "The Naples and Florence Observer," another completely vanished and very tiny paper, remarks, quote, "The American drinks are selling well now, the Neapolitans having taken quite a liking to them. We have actually heard of one gentleman having swallowed no less than 6 in a single evening. And what is worth noting, he says he felt all the better for them." Well, I shouldn't wonder. If you caught me after 6 cocktails, I'd be extremely friendly. In our opinion, the best are the ginger and the coffee, the former being an excellent stomachic. That was an American coffee cocktail that actually had no coffee in it. It just looked like coffee. He says, "The novelty of imbibing through a straw appears to have tickled the fancies of many, and we hear that several people, instead of sherry cobbler, make at their own house a pleasant drink of coffee and ice, which taken through a straw is exceedingly refreshing." That's the real Italian vice, is not alcohol, it's caffeine. That is what Italians really like, is coffee, coffee, coffee. And the first thing they do with this new American way of making drinks is, can we do something with coffee with it? Yes, we can. And they're all in, and suddenly there are iced coffee drinks all up and down the Italian peninsula, eventually ending up with the cafe shakerato, which if you're in any cafe in Italy, they throw a shot of espresso, a little sugar into a cocktail shaker, shake it up and pour it into a cocktail glass, and you shoot it down, and you're just better off, especially when it's 90 degrees and humid. So anyway, we hear about more American-style bars slowly opening in Italy at a slower pace than like Paris, which has probably 20 of them by 1900. But you hear there's a Mr. Bomboni in Florence has a famous American bar starting at about 1860, so quite early. There's an American bar in the big Galleria in Torino where the Campari Cafe is. And there's an American bar in this same thing, the Galleria Nazionale. There's one in Milano on the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, the main drag. Grand Hotel in Rome has one, same ownership as the Savoy Hotel in London. And there are many others eventually. They come in, and these are mostly for tourists, but for travelers, really. We don't really have modern-style tourists. But there are, they do have this. We should get the next cocktail going, if you don't mind. Thank you so much, because we've got a nice one from my homie Ferruccio Mazzone there. You start seeing the Americano itself not being a substitute for the, how do I put this? It starts coming out as that do-it-yourself American-style vermouth like we were doing there, or bittered vermouth. You start seeing that as a mixed drink more and more around the world around 1900. It starts to spread, and it's always interesting to track it. There's a quote from 1909 from an English novel. "We drank vermouth and bitters in an Italian grocer's in Old Compton Street, as good as any I ever had at Campari's." So somebody there is taking the vermouth and the bitters, this Americano-style drink, and making it there and selling it as a bar drink. You see in America, you see this. In Argentina, you see the Bagley all'Americana cocktail. Bagley was an American guy who went down to Argentina and saw that there were all these orange trees in Buenos Aires that people were throwing away the skins, and being a good Yankee businessman, he said, I could use those skins. And he makes a really nice orange liqueur there that's like kind of an orange aperitivo. It's both orangey, and it's also got some bitter in it. And that becomes very popular. And his drink here is, thank you so much, by the way, is half vermouth, half this weird Bagley's Hesperidina liqueur that my friend Federico Cucco was just kind enough to send me a bottle from Buenos Aires of, and it's really cool and weird tasting stuff. You should look into this one. Yeah. Hesperidina Bagley, or Hesperidina as it's called. It's really neat. It kind of splits the difference between a Chinato and a Curacao. It's very cool. Anyway, but you see they got that idea. You take the bitter and you take the vermouth and you mix it. But in South America, they tend to like their drinks a little on the sweet side. So there's also some drops of cherry brandy in this, and some maraschino, and some orange bitters, and some curacao, because why not? Let's just double down. This is this very obscure book, the Manuel del Cantinero, published, written by this guy Moreno, and published in 1910 in Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and Havana. So it's kind of pan-Latin book. You see in one of the German drink books, this insane compendium by Schoenfeld and Leibold in 1913. They've got the Americano labeled as the Americano. And how do they make that? With 2 Stücke Eis, which is 2 pieces of ice, but the German word is fun to say, so I'll say that. 2 Scheiben Zitrone, 2 slices of lemon, a spritzer of Angostura, a liqueur glass of Fernet Branca, a cocktail glass of Italian vermouth, and then you fill it with seltzer water. We're kind of moving very much into the realm of the modern Americano here. It's got the seltzer water, but notice it's not Campari, it's something else. And it turns out, it could be anything else. Campari did not own the Americano. They kind of staked a claim there, but and they owned it by persistence, but not by origin. Originally, the Americano was whatever bitter you had mixed with vermouth and soda. And there are many, many good bitters that you can make. A thing that I find very amusing to do, I know I lead a sheltered life, is to stick out a bottle of vermouth and several bottles of bitters, when you're hanging out with people, and some soda, and try it. See what you like. Try this one, try that one. Splash, how much do you want? And it makes for a fun afternoon, at least for if you're a total drinks geek. So this one is the St. Ciro cocktail, S-I-R-O, from Ferruccio Mazzon, 1920, the first Italian cocktail book, at least that I've been able to track down. It's an ounce of Vermouth di Torino, Cocchi, of course, an ounce of Dolan dry, so French vermouth, the dry French vermouth in the French style, half an ounce of Aperitivo Cappelletti, so you've got 2 vermouths plus aperitif in here, and then a splash of curacao and a dash of Angostura bitters. I think that's a pretty pleasant drink. A little sweet, but damn tasty. And you see the people are starting to do this more and more and use these ingredients. I'm going to skip ahead for several others. There's Hugo Enslin in New York in 1916. He has several cocktails with Fernet Branca, an Italian vermouth, or Calisaya, another Italian bitter or Amaro type thing. He's got the Italian cocktail, 2/3 Italian vermouth, 1/3 Fernet Branca, 2 dashes gum syrup, because it really needs to be sweeter, and a dash of absinthe. There's that sporty dash of absinthe. Another guy who had been a New Yorker for quite some time and had actually taught fencing in New York. He had also been a cowpuncher in Alberta, Canada, and in maybe a little bit in Wyoming. He was the son of an Italian count, and he came over here and worked over here and spent 10 years, 12 years in America, then went back to his home in Florence. He has an interesting variation on this, and we get it in a letter. The first documented record of it is in a letter from Francis Hayes, an English friend, to our friend here, Camillo Negroni, or Count Negroni, from October 13th, 1920, and it has a little paragraph in it. Dear Negroni, I was very glad to get your letter, but sorry to hear you have been so unwell. But as you say, you can drink, smoke, and I am sure laugh just as much as ever. I feel you are not much to be pitied. You must not take more than 20 Negronis in one day. How I wish I could come out now and help you drink 1 or 2. So our friend Negroni here, having been in America, tasted this Americano, which was, by then popular, and having been a gambler in New York and a fencing teacher and a very sporty guy all around, he thought it needed something to, the word he evidently used was irrobustire, to beef up. that drink, and so he put in a splash of gin, or he had his bartender put in a splash of gin. We get the Negroni. Now, there's all kinds of smoke being blown about the origins of this drink, but this letter is authentic and it's pretty clear. Other people were doing similar things. And the interesting thing is it has absolutely no impact in the 1920s. Nobody's ever heard of a Negroni cocktail then. He did it, he's there, but it didn't really catch on until considerably later in Italy under that name. And meanwhile, other people, turns out, were just as smart as he is. You've got, I'm going to skip ahead to 1926. Fernando, is it okay if I read this thing? Okay. Fernando Castellane, the great European cocktail and spirits historian. We're fortunate enough to have him here, and he's a lovely guy who will share some of his incredible discoveries. He came up with this booklet by Piero Grandi in Paris, who was an Italian bartender in Paris, called Cocktails. And he did a special Campari edition. Campari had been sold in Paris since at least 1910, maybe earlier, and it seems to have been popular in Paris. And we'll see there's a bunch of Parisian drinks there involving this stuff. And here's his Campari Cardinal from 1926. In a cocktail glass, pour several drops of bitter Campari, 1/3 gin, 1/3 Italian vermouth. Transfer it all into a big glass. I don't know why you had to do the transferring, but anyway. And add ice. Afterwards, serve it in a cocktail glass, adding a dash of the juice of the peel of lemon, of lemon oil, basically. So a twist on top. But, all right, so did this guy, Piero Grandi, know this drink from Florence? If so, he didn't use Negroni's name, because it's basically the same drink, maybe a little less Campari. Gentlemen and ladies are allowed to differ on proportions as long as the ingredients are okay. And you see, this is like, okay, this is really very close to the Negroni, except it's up. And clearly, that idea of mixing gin, an aperitivo, and vermouth, so that Americano thing was good, but it's, what if we put some extra booze in there? That's kind of catching around, and it's moving around, spreading. It's a simple idea. You just have to see it once. And then you can, I learned a little trick to do with this simple Americano, and it's a good trick. Let me show you. And what do you call that? Well, everybody calls it something different. For instance, Jean Lupoiu, a French bartender who had also tended bar in Indochina and all in various other exotic locations. He has, in his 1927 cocktail book, he has the Julio cocktail. How do you make that? 3 dashes of bitter Campari, 1/6 Rossi, 1/6 Vermouth Cinzano, and 2/3 gin. So, again, these same chemicals, in different proportions are coming up there. Then you get 1927 also, Barflies and Cocktails, a great book from Harry's Bar in Paris. Not one, but 2 different drinks that are still made today. One is contributed by Erskine Gwynn, an American playboy who was running a pretty trivial magazine there for the Boulevardier of Paris, for the idle rich, and he comes in with his Boulevardier cocktail. How do you make a Boulevardier? 1/3 Campari, 1/3 Italian vermouth, 1/3 bourbon whiskey. Okay, a little different, He's American, so that's his take on this, is you put the bourbon in. But in the same book, Sparrow Robertson, an absolutely bizarre character that I should do a whole seminar on. He was an American sport and foot racer and lightweight boxer who moved to Paris and was made the sports correspondent of the Paris Herald Tribune, the American paper there, and was the craziest prose stylist. He made Gertrude Stein look like an accountant in his prose style. It's just this insane double switchback stream of consciousness, and it was a column every day. It would run it, and the people would buy it just to see how crazy Sparrow was, and see if they could make heads or tails out of it. But he was always around and out and about in all the bars. He called everybody he knew Old Pal because he couldn't remember anybody's name. I sympathize. And he contributes his Old Pal cocktail. How do you make an Old Pal? 1/3 Canadian Club, 1/3 Italian Vermouth, and 1/3 Campari. So clearly people, this simple formula has gotten into several little sporting communities. In Paris it's there. It was there in Florence. 1929 you get a cocktail contest sponsored by Paris, the Week in Paris magazine. And one of the sponsors is Campari, so there are Campari drinks in here, again, the Campari company being clever with the marketing. And they have a Boulevardier in there attributed to Robert of the Vier restaurant. And his Boulevardier is 1/3 Dubonnet. That's a pretty good substitute, slightly bittered, vermouthy type aperitif. 1/3 Raphael, another one. 1/6 Campari, and 1/6 Courvoisier brandy. That's actually a very pleasant drink if you can get the Raphael, and you got to use French Dubonnet. But also Albert of the Chatham Bar, an American bar, the one that catered heavily to Americans, and was a famous bar in Paris across the street from Harry's Bar, which is still there, but the Chatham is long gone. He contributes the Campari Net cocktail, 1/4 Campari, 1/4 Vermouth, Italian Cora Vermouth, not Martini and Rossi. He's a heretic. 1/2 Gordon Gin, pretty good proportions there, and serve with a lemon peel. And that's his Campari Net. That becomes the kind of up version of the Negroni. It's that tradition. Then there are at least 3 or 4 other drinks involving that same general idea. I don't need to just sit here and read recipes off to you. That sounds a little dull. The Lucien Godin, some people still make. That's a popular one. With gin, 1/2 Gordon's gin, 1/2 Campari, 1/6 Campari, 1/6 Cointreau, and 1/6 French Vermouth, and many others. Other Boulevardiers, and people are doing riffs on these to the point where an American writer, Nina Wilcox Putnam, a humor columnist, in 1933, she starts her description of her time in Paris by saying, "All Gaul was divided into 3 parts. 1 part gin, 1 part vermouth, and 1 part Italian bitters." So clearly, the Parisians had gone nuts for this stuff. And what happened in Paris went everywhere. And you start seeing these more and more variations. Eventually, in 1939, at the Floridita, you see in Havana, Cuba, of all places, you see the first appearance of the name Negroni on a recipe. It's the Negroni, and that's 1/4 of Campari, a 1/2 Gordon Gin, and 1/2 of Vermouth Carpano, and a 1/2 ounce also of Cinzano, so split Vermouth. Constante there was always fancy, and it goes. At this point, we're kind of sliding into World War II. By the late 30s, 1939, Germany invades Poland. 1940, Germany invades Holland, France, and so on and so forth. 1941, Italy declares war on America. All these ingredients are no longer available. But of course, what happens is, especially to Italy. I didn't mean to do that. Well, we're pretty much at the end of the PowerPoint anyway, thank God. So I'm just going to shut that down. I prefer not to use these things because I always feel like I should talk about the slides, and then I never do, and then I feel guilty. But anyway, what you see is suddenly 1943, hundreds of thousands of American and British soldiers are in Italy, and they're drinking vermouth, they're drinking Italian drinks, they're drinking all this stuff, and they're in part deriving a taste for it, and part deriving a deep and life-lasting hatred for the stuff, because it's part of the worst part of their lives, and it's all there is to drink, and it reminds them of fear and terror. And after the war, that tends to be the generation who didn't put vermouth into their drinks. They just like, I don't want to see that stuff ever again. Meanwhile, but at the same time, you've got in the 1940s the rise of American and global tourism, the rise of mass tourism. Suddenly, it's possible to fly to Italy rather than having to take a steamship, and you can go there and you can bum around the cafes, and next thing you know, there's Orson Welles drinking Negronis and coming home and talking about them as this great drink. And for all we know, that's the Italian name for a drink that was invented in Paris or New York. We just don't know. As you can see, what I tried to show is this stuff got very cosmopolitan very fast, and it got all over the world very fast. And and the idea is so simple that everybody can easily replicate it and come up with their own versions of it. And you'll get the same drink in 8 different places. That doesn't mean that one person stole it from the other one. It's quite possible that there were just 8 different, different drinks because the ingredients are simple. The construction is so logical. And that's always the problem with drink history. So many people run around claiming I invented this phenomenal thing. I'm the first one who thought of putting vodka in a tomato juice cocktail. Well, that's kind of natural. Vodka's tomato juice cocktail was a hangover cure. Vodka and gin were easily available. Somebody's going to put the hooch in the hangover cure, and that's it doesn't take a rocket scientist to do that. And suddenly you've got 2 different people or 5 different people who all claim to have invented the Bloody Mary. We've got one final cocktail coming from the craziest Italian mixologist of them all. Elvezio Grassi in 1936, he wrote a book called 1,000 Cocktails, but immediately had to overstamp cocktails with misture, mixtures, because Mussolini had outlawed the use of the word cocktail because it was an Americanism and it wasn't pure Italian. So suddenly the book is 1,000 mixtures. And it begins with cocktail history, and then he talks about all of the sources he used, and almost none of them check out. They're either fictional or some bartender he met once, But he did work in Argentina, and then he was living and working in Lugano in Switzerland. Unfortunately, he was the head of the local fascist bartenders association there, so maybe not such a nice guy. But he was a creative bartender in the extreme, and he came up with some of the most weird sounding but delicious drinks. There are more drinks with Batavia Arak in his book than in every other cocktail book put together, by a factor of 3 or 4. I mean, it's amazing. He loves this most pungent of all ingredients, and he's happy to do it. What we have here is Miro Vermouth de Reos Rojo, a lovely Spanish vermouth, Batavia Arak, Smith & Cross Jamaican rum, pineapple syrup, and Angostura bitters. Is that one of? That's this one? Yeah. Yep. That's a bold set of ingredients, right? But
Tastes better than it smells.
yeah, you get the Arak in the nose, maybe a little heavy, but it tastes really good. Should I repeat it? Yeah. It's an ounce of red vermouth. We're using a Spanish vermouth here because we can. So 30, I got to do this in milliliters, actually, because the proportions don't work otherwise. It's 30 milliliters vermouth, red vermouth, 40 milliliters Batavia Arak, 10 milliliters Grand Marnier, 10 milliliters Jamaican rum, 10 milliliters pineapple syrup, and 2 dashes of Angostura bitters. So it's kind of... Yeah, we use Smith & Cross Jamaican rum. Why? Because Eric Seed has Smith & Cross.
Would you mind repeating that one more time?
Yeah. 30 milliliters red vermouth, 40 milliliters Batavia Arak, and then 10 each of Grand Marnier, strong Jamaican rum, and pineapple syrup.
Would that have been on the slides, and will you make your slides available?
I will try. Let me see it.
No, I mean later.
Oh,
Put it up right now, but we get them from you.
yeah, the slides aren't super informative. Hold on, yeah. As you can see. Yeah, that came out. This is called the Giralda. I don't know why. Is that, yeah, unfortunately I knocked the thing out and, is that gonna work? It ought to. All right, let me end it and start it again. Okay. All right, come on. Now it's frozen. Yeah, I don't want to, hold on. There we go. Shut that off. All right, Giralda. There we go. Okay, there it is. So anyway, this is kind of the when Italy jumps into mixology, it goes full in, and this is a phenomenally cool and weird book, but it's available through the EUVS website, which has every old cocktail book known to mankind, seemingly. And it's also, there's a reprint. If you're ever in Italy, you can find it in some exclusive bar gear type stores. It's a very, very interesting and weird book. But you can see, you know, this is where this mixology takes us. This Italian, when they discover the cocktail, when they start getting really into American mixology, they get pretty far with it. And this guy's sort of at the head of a long list of other famous and wonderful Italian mixologists. But at that, we've got you know, a few minutes for questions, and I think it's better to spend that time on questions than on me ranting and raving. I'll start all the way at the back because your hand was very quick.
All the variations and versions you mentioned of the prior Negronis had lemon as a garnish. Is there a time when people started putting the orange zest on there? Or?
Well, it's interesting because you notice some of the Americanos used orange, right? And then I think lemon was the early ones. That was particularly in Paris. The French prefer lemon. In Italy, orange, it's a little sweeter. It fits the Italian palate a little better. And I think the orange, the Italian version, won out eventually. But, you know, it's good with both, really. They both work. The pineapple syrup? No, I think it was just, you know, plain pineapple syrup, you know, bought from a syrup person. I don't think he made it himself. I think he had, yeah, he went to the Italians have lots of syrups, you know, so I think it was probably that. I don't think it wasn't like, you know, San Francisco style. Yeah, Dan.
Is the etymological origin of the Americano, is it Amer for bitter or American as in
It's American,
citizen of
yeah.
the U.S.?
It's as in American as in the U.S.
Because the flag certainly suggested that, but I've seen some people suggest that it came from Amer
Yeah, don't
for
listen to
bitter.
them.
Okay. And I have one other quick question. In a couple of those Parisian cocktail books you mentioned, I've seen Torino just listed as an ingredient. Would that just be a generic for Italian vermouth, or was there a brand called Torino?
I think that's generic for Italian vermouth, because, you know, the French had their own vermouth, and so that's just use the Torino stuff. Torino was the great I mean, they made vermouth and still make vermouth all over Italy, but Torino was the commercial powerhouse, and that's where the industry really was. That's where the exports came from, and so I think I would, if I were going to use that, if I were looking at that, I would just use vermouth to Torino.
Awesome, thanks.
Please.
When and where does the split between Americano being a bottled cocktail that we've talked about happen between the modern product that we have now? Like what?
As in
As
the
in
modern Coke
Coke
Americano?
Americano, yeah, exactly.
Well, that's a survivor. I mean, that's all that is. You know, that it's a survivor of, I mean, Eric can answer this too, I suspect.
Is this on? Yep. I mean,
Yeah.
think of it this way. We've talked about Americano as vermouth and bitters. And, you know, when we arrived on the scene to look at this, I initially thought, well, what is Americano? And in Italian wine law and now European law, Americano is a defined category. And it's its own style of aromatized wine that must contain wormwood, another type of bitter, and has allowances for citrus and has allowances for color. But in no way in law today can you have a spirit Americano. It must be aromatized wine. And when that law came into play, I mean, it's when all these laws came into play. And it wasn't necessarily by Coke's prodding, so.
Yeah, I mean, Coke is a survivor of this, but
Right.
also, you know, as you saw, everybody
Many
had
others.
these. And I think they were using spirits for some of these. You know, that's in Strucky's book. That's how he tells you to compound these. Often is to use, you know, pour the Amaro into the vermouth. So that's changed. I think it's changed under the influence of winemakers. You know, and it's not. You know, it's perfectly. It's absolutely fine. It's not like some weird corruption of the genre. It's just the way they make it today. Others?
Yeah, we'll leave it at that.
Are we all good?
No other questions?
If you leave feedback for this, take a moment to rate this seminar. This slide is atrocious. I didn't make this one, but if you will be automatically entered into a sweepstakes to win the conga shaker. It's the thing with the two knobs on the side that you can dance around your living room leading a conga line with all your friends until they leave and go to a real bar. But thank you so much, and have a great, thank you. Cheers. And thanks again to our apprentices who absolutely killed with this. That's a good cocktail.
Yeah, that's serious. Yeah, thank you, man.